You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined again by Megan Kimble to talk about her book, City Limits, Infrastructure, Inequality, and the Future of America's Highways. We shout out the folks fighting back against highways, the history behind building big roads, and what the future looks like for advocacy. Stay with us. Hey everybody, I am on vacation this week, but I wanted to flash back to an episode with Megan Kimble about her book, City Limits. We're about to have Patrick Kennedy come on the show, and some of the stuff that he talks about, we talk about on this show specifically. So some good history before you listen to that next episode that's new. We're going to go back to something a little bit older. So this is episode 482 with Megan Kimble from May of 2024. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super amazing and kind Patreon supporters. We appreciate you all keeping this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire going. To join this merry band of bus riders, bus drivers, and chupistas, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note sent with a cool train station stamp. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. And if you want to just give a single $1 a month, you'll be able to get the podcast with 0 outside ads or podcast recommendations in Patreon. We'll leave information in the show notes about how to get the show in your podcatcher. We'll also recently put up some bonus material, including audio of my first ever e-bike ride, and have a weekly free post from our newsletter intro, so check it out if you haven't already. And speaking of scarves, get your heavyweight bus and bike scarves. You'll definitely need one for you, your friends, your colleagues, just to show everyone in that city hall or legislature your advocacy in clothing that won't get taken by security on the way in. If you want to get one of the Buster Bike scarves or the lightweight bike scarf for hot climates, visit theoverheadwire.com or support us on Patreon. But there are many other ways to support the show, including buying books from us on the bookshop site, either the books from our authors that we interview or any book you like. bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. And find our Cars Are Cholesterol merch at bit.ly/carsarecholesterol. And for anything else, including the Town Planning and Practice audiobook that plays like a podcast, visit theoverheadwire.com. You can also get that podcast from Libby at your public library. And finally, definitely sign up for the 20-year-old newsletter we do at theoverheadwire.com, established in 2006, and our over 110,000 item link archive tagged by topic and city. We'll leave a YouTube explainer video in the show notes as well for that one too. Or you can just keep listening and enjoying the show. We appreciate that as well. You can find us mostly on Blue Sky and Mastodon, sometimes on Threads, Instagram, Flickr, YouTube, Substack, and LinkedIn if you want to connect, usually at the Overhead Wire, but with Flickr, it's Transit Nerds. We've got some great stuff coming up for you in our 13th year of the podcast, so keep on listening for announcements on gatherings, but for now, just enjoy the show. Hey everybody, I decided to move this part of my thank yous up from the post credits to right here smack dab at the start because I do want to recognize the folks who are Dallas tier or higher Patreon supporters. It really helps us out and we super appreciate it. When I get new supporters, I'll update this section, so I hope that happens often. So first names only, but big thanks to Andrew, Ben, Derek, Gabriel, Glenn, Greg, James, Jeremy, Jim, Joseph, Catherine, Mal, Marcus, Matthew, Mike, Nicholas, Abraham, Oliver, Steve, Abby, Matthew, Sylvia, and recently added Andrew A. All right, thank you all very much. Let's get to the show. Megan Kimble, welcome back to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for being here again. A lot has happened since we last chatted for episode 403 back in October of, I think, 2022. I've asked you then how you felt about Austin, so perhaps maybe I should ask you now how you feel about Texas more broadly at this very moment.
Oh, wow, that's a loaded question. I mean, I still love being a journalist in Texas. There's so much to cover. But, you know, a lot has happened in the political landscape since the last time we talked that has nothing to do with transportation or housing, which I cover. You know, I just lived through the hottest summer on record in Austin. So that was a bit soul crushing. But, you know, I love it here still. It's spring. The flowers are blooming. The bluebonnets are out. It's gorgeous.
Oh, I love it. I love the bluebonnet season. It's great. And you're in Mueller now. That's cool. I flew out of the airport when I was in undergrad. For track, we had to go all over the place to run races. And so 1998 was still open when I was running my first season. So I always remember like the airport and everything. And then now it's something totally different.
Yeah, I actually was probably here last time we talked. I moved in March of 2020 to Mueller. And it's been really cool to see as it's gotten built out. And I mean, as you know, it kind of comes up in my book. Like I had this moment a realization just walking my dog one day, like, oh, I live in a place that used to be an airport. It's relevant to the discussion of highway removal of like, we can change infrastructure. I like, it's like you can see, I've looked up on Google Earth, you can actually see the airport footprint and you can see it mapped on like current streets. So I live on like a former runway, which I just love that. Like it's all changeable.
Yeah, it's a really cool situation. I just remember all the planning for it too, and talking with Jim Walker and some other folks, and all the stuff that went into that. And obviously, there's folks that wanted more density. There's some folks that wanted less density, and how it ended up is a really interesting story as well. Maybe that's another story for another day.
Mm-hmm.
You finished the book. It's called City Limits: Infrastructure, Inequality, and the Future of America's Highways. How has it been received so far?
So far, great. I mean, I've mostly just been in Texas. I went to Houston and Dallas and San Antonio and did an event here in Austin, and people are really fired up about it. It's really exciting to have it out in the world and have like new readers come to it who I might not have anticipated. So it feels great.
What's the response been so far? I mean, like, what have folks said to you when they talk to you about reading the book, or, folks that maybe were in the book and maybe didn't want to be?
Yeah, I have not heard from TxDOT. I am bracing myself for an email or phone call. So TxDOT, if you're listening, happy to talk. Um, I mean, it's only been out 2 weeks, so I don't know that all but the like most dedicated readers have had time to read it. But those that have come to my events have had great questions about like why we're doing what we're doing, why we keep doing what we're doing. I did an event in Houston and several of my sources came. Someone in the book is Modesty Cooper, who is a Black woman in her 30s who will lose her home when the North Houston Highway Improvement Project goes forward. She lives right next to I-10, which goes through the Fifth Ward. So she came to the event, which was really rewarding and great to see her. And also at the event was this woman, Oneri Goodry, who is a Black woman in her 70s who lost her home when I-10 was originally built in through the Fifth Ward. And so in my mind, those are like this kind of like generational pair, like they sort of show we are repeating past mistakes. Oneri's family's home, that is now a highway, is like 2 blocks from where Modesty lives. And so like in the book, they're like very much in conversation. I think in my brain they are, but those two people have never met each other, but they were both at my event.
Oh.
And so I got to be like, Modesty, Oneri, like, here's who you are. Like, you're both Fifth Warders. And they like hit it off. They exchanged phone numbers. And that was so rewarding to like watch them have a conversation.
That's awesome. Yeah. No, I mean, something I really liked about the book was how it was similar in kind of like the idea of talking to folks and thinking about how people interconnected as Conor Doherty's Golden Gates, which sources the origins of the YIMBY movement here in California. And there were a lot of personal stories and accounts from people in the fight that you talked about. What were some of the sentiments and feelings, though, that you got from these folks when you saw them at meetings, when you had them tell you their stories? I mean, obviously, the two that you just mentioned were key to telling the story of Houston. But I'm curious, like, how you felt when you're interacting with folks who were part of the fight and also just dealing with the stress and the uncertainty.
Yeah, I mean, I think people and myself, when I was reporting this book, and activists like sort of oscillate between hope and despair all the time. And it really depends on the day and the environment and what's happening. But I talked to people who are in the footprint of this highway expansion in Houston, which will demolish 1,200 homes. So a lot of people are impacted by it. Most of them, according to TxDOT's own analysis, are low income or minority population. And I think they feel a lot of like despair. Like I heard again and again, you can't fight TxDOT. The highway department comes in, they want to expand a highway, and like what they want to do gets done. Like if TxDOT wants your home, TxDOT's going to get your home. And so I think that's kind of the general kind of undercurrent of like a little bit of futility of like, well, why bother fighting? But what I chronicle in my book and what is really heartening is like people are beginning to fight. There's a group in Houston called Stop TxDOT I-45, and they have mounted like a really remarkable grassroots campaign against TxDOT to try to stop this expansion, and or if it's going to happen, to try to like get concessions and better mitigation measures for people who are impacted. So I think it, again, like I oscillate and the people I talk to oscillate all the time between hope and despair around like, well, the fight is futile, but like you still have to fight.
Why did you think it was important to chronicle the fight?
One reason I wanted to chronicle the fight is that it's very new. For a very long time, TxDOT did what it wanted to do, and there was essentially no opposition. They have the authority of eminent domain. That authority is enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. If TxDOT wants your land to widen the highway, you basically have no recourse except to negotiate a better price. But these highways have like enormous impacts on people's lives. It's not just people on the footprint of the expansion. It's all of the air pollution that we suffer, all the noise pollution, and like really importantly, all the greenhouse gases that are being emitted and making Austin and Houston and all the places in Texas hotter and drier and harder to live in. And so I think like I was so motivated to chronicle the opposition because it's such a David and Goliath fight. Like TxDOT has so many resources. Its latest 10-year budget is like more than $100 billion. So they have absolutely all the resources. They can wait you out and wear you down. And yet, ordinary people, young people, people in their 20s and 30s are fighting against TxDOT. And I think that's like a really remarkable kind of grassroots movement that I feel like is really new and worth chronicling.
I was really heartened to see that there were wins too, right? Because you can fight and then you can lose really badly, but there are also wins. I mean, saving some of the units that might have been demolished along I-45, at least getting discussions started at USDOT about these topics. Whether or not it worked or not is another question, but I was heartened to see some wins.
Yeah, totally. And like, I think for a long time, no one really bothered to fight. And also, like, TxDOT sort of presents its plans as so technical and they have all these traffic models. And so they're very hard for ordinary people to understand. So we should just trust the engineers that what they're doing is best for us and our city. And I think what Stop TxDOT I-45 did in a very compelling way is to be like, actually, we can counter your argument. We don't believe this is progress. And what you mentioned is like a great example. So the loss at the ballpark is this apartment complex in Houston that it is in the footprint of the expansion. TxDOT bought that building and started moving tenants out of it. And then they like put up construction fencing and were moving forward with demolishing that apartment complex. And a volunteer, just like a normal person with Stop TxDOT I-45, this guy, Michael Moritz, noticed that construction fencing. The project had been paused by this point by the federal government. So the federal government told TxDOT, you can't proceed with any activities related to this while we investigate civil rights concerns, which we can talk about later. So they noticed this construction was happening and looked, like thousands of pages deep into an appendix in the final environmental impact statement and saw that TxDOT had actually not accounted for demolishing all three buildings. They had only in the EIS accounted for the front building, and yet they were preparing to tear down all three. And I think that speaks to the fact that, like, with a little bit of scrutiny, with just like a little bit of due diligence of reading these very dense 8,000 page long environmental documents, like activists can have real wins because, again, like for so long, this just wasn't questioned. So the win is that they basically like saved those two back buildings through a protest.
What did they do with the buildings eventually?
I don't know. There was discussion about turning them into like permanent supportive housing for people exiting homelessness. I don't know if that's happened yet, but that was like the latest I know is that there was discussions about that.
I want to go back in time a bit because that's another interesting part of the book. You explore some of the rumored but perhaps lesser known history about the interstate system. And I've always heard that Eisenhower wasn't actually a fan of going through cities. He just wanted to go to cities. But you flesh out a little bit more detail about the discussion, also about what people were sold by folks like Norman Bell Geddes. And so I want to hear more about you diving into the history and what you were learning and kind of that untold part of the discussion, which is maybe they weren't a good idea at the time and they're still not a good idea now.
Yeah, totally. I loved that reporting. The historical part of the book starts with the 1939 World's Fair, which you just referenced. Norman Bell Geddes is this industrial designer who came up with this exhibit called Futurama. And it basically like sold the future of car-centric cities. Like cars were still very new. And so he like came up with this massive model showing how we could connect far-flung hamlets with urban areas, and those urban areas would be cleaner and more technologically oriented as we had these like wide ribbons of beautiful highways. And I really wanted to start from like a place of empathy of like the car was this amazing technological advancement. Like understandably, people flocked to it. Like it gave them freedom, it gave them autonomy. It was a miracle. It was a miracle for travel for a lot of people. And so people started buying cars, by the millions. And, fast forward to the Eisenhower administration in 1956, he passes the Interstate Highway Act. And I too had heard that, he wasn't a fan of building highways through the middle of cities. There's this memorandum that you can find online that captures a meeting in April of 1960 of him saying, that was against my wishes to build highways through cities. But I was like, well, there's got to be more there. So I drove to Abilene, Kansas, which is where the Eisenhower Presidential Library is and where all of his archives are, and spent 3 days going through the archives and didn't know what I would find. But when I was there, I learned about this guy, John Bragdon, who Eisenhower had appointed to oversee the implementation of the Interstate Highway Program. They were like old Navy buddies. They met at West Point. And so Bragdon starts looking into the program in 1959 and 1960. He finds out it's running massively over budget. It was a $25 billion program. It's running $11 billion over budget, largely because states have been taking the like generous federal contribution the federal government agreed to pay 90% of the cost of the construction of urban highways. They had been taking that money and building urban highways to try to accommodate all these millions of cars that were suddenly kind of pouring onto city streets. And Bragdon looks into that and he like asks Congress, he's like, well, was the intent of this legislation to allow cities to build highways through them, or was the intent really to connect the country, to build connections between cities? There's a report that's produced. It's called Legislative Intent with Respect to Interstate Routes in Urban Areas. And I remember I saw that and I was like, oh, this is it, right? Like this is the documentation of whether or not this was the intent of the interstate highway system. Like, spoiler alert, it was not the intent of the interstate highway program. So Bragdon basically writes up his findings in a report. It's called the interim report. And it's a really amazing document that lays out very compellingly how urban highways, one, were like not what federal money was supposed to be spent on. The federal money was for a national objective, which was connecting the country. It's the Cold War. Eisenhower was really worried about like evacuating cities in case of nuclear attack, moving arms across the country, moving troops potentially across the country. And that like the national aim was connecting the country. So he lays that out, like this is not what this money should be spent for. And then he ultimately presented this report to Eisenhower. He says, all of the traffic experts agree that the way to solve urban congestion is not through highways, it's through transit systems. And yet cities are taking all of this federal money and they're actively tearing out transit to build roads. So he gives a bunch of examples. And he's like, we should require cities to undertake proper urban planning. Highways are but one way to move people, and driving is but one way to plan a city. And it's this really amazing statement, which like I think most urbanists today would fully agree with. And it's happened in 1960. You know, this like Republican engineer is presenting to Eisenhower, like, hey, this is not what this money was supposed to be spent on. And so that's when there's this memorandum of like, okay, so there's this presentation. I found the actual like Bragdon's note cards, like what he actually read and presented to Eisenhower. So I have the actual text of that.
Wow.
I mean, I'm like in the presidential library, like, oh my God, this is amazing. It's like quiet, you know, it's like hushed space. So then Eisenhower's reaction to this presentation is what's captured in this memorandum published a few days later. And in that, he says, the matter of running interstate routes through the congested part of cities was against his wishes, and those who had implemented the program that way had done so not following his direction. So I like saw that, and it's like, okay, so Eisenhower did not want it to be this way, but like, why didn't he change anything? Bragdon had told him like, hey, what you should do is tell the Bureau of Public Roads to give more guidance to states that federal money should not be spent to build urban highways. Well, it's like 4 years into the interstate program, a lot of money has already been allocated to states, and it's also an election year. So that is captured in like a note by Eisenhower's secretary, who has like a diary that she writes every day of the day's events, Eisenhower's reactions. And in her diary from that day, she says, these people were in for a meeting on the roads program, and like General Parsons and others think it would be murder to move in an election year. So like best I can tell, like the reason Eisenhower didn't do anything is he felt like his hands were tied. It would be politically difficult to direct states to do otherwise, and he didn't want to risk pissing them off in an election year.
And it wasn't even his election either, right? It was Kennedy versus Nixon.
Right. But, you know, loyal to his party.
Right. Yeah. No, I understand. It's just interesting because, you know, Nixon ended up losing anyway. So it's like an interesting kind of footnote in the whole history of transportation and road building. And,
totally.
You know, the interesting part to me was like just two words inside of the 1956 statute, local needs, quote unquote, local needs, was what allowed all these people in cities that were road engineers to build these interstate highways that rip through neighborhoods and things like that. So it's the language and the legalese and all that stuff is really minuscule in allowing kind of what can happen and what can't.
Yeah, that local needs is what Bragdon asked the Department of Commerce to investigate, like Congress's intent behind those words. Did local needs mean that cities should be able to use this money to solve whatever local problems they want, or should interstate highways be routed according to like local preference, which is to say maybe on existing routes or where they already have right of way? And that's when Congress was like, no, the Bureau of Public Roads is kind of applying this too liberally. That intent of local needs is that it should be, local needs are subservient to the national interest of connecting the country. This money should not be spent to solve local congestion.
I think this is a question where urbanists will probably say, well, of course, this is how it's going to be. But I wonder what you think U.S. cities would be like if we had followed Bragdon's report.
Oh, man. I mean, I thought about that a lot. Like he so compellingly lays out how transit is the solution to congestion. So like thinking about how a city like Austin, where I live, or Los Angeles, where I grew up, almost every Western city would be different if we had robust transit. Like, I think we would be more like Washington, D.C. or New York City. You know, you can see them on the Eastern Seaboard. Cities that have good transit, they are much more dense, they are much more walkable. The Sun Belt in Western US, like sprawl defines our cities. It's kind of hard to imagine, but like it's so compelling to think of a place like Austin or LA that's like more compact and more walkable that just does not cover so much area because we have transit, because transit would be the like the backbone on which a city develops rather than highways.
You did go back and look at a lot of history, which is really impressive. But I'm wondering also how much you were surprised by some of the kind of revisionism we hear today from like think tanks and road advocates and others who, you know, say kind of that same thing where they're like, roads are the only way and what people want. And so we should just continue this direction forever and ever and ever.
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised by how kind of like bipartisan or non-political the issue was until like well into the 1980s. Like politicians from both parties in Congress supported more money for transit. And this guy, John B. Anderson, the chairman of the House Republican Conference, testified on the floor of the House in support of an amendment that would have opened up the Highway Trust Fund, which is the basic funding mechanism for highways, to transit. And he says drivers should support transit if for no other reason that it will get other people off roads. Like if you want to be driving, I don't want to be driving, you should support transit so that you get me off the road and it's less congested for you. And so like again throughout the 70s and 80s, transit was just kind of considered, it's like a very practical solution to urban congestion. It was like under Reagan that we got a dedicated portion of the Highway Trust Fund dedicated to transit. And both Reagan and Nixon, who also dedicated more money to transit, are on record being like, highways are not the solution to all of urban congestion problems. Like highways, Nixon said something to the effect of like, we know that adding more highways can sometimes make the problem worse. So like I was floored by like how kind of, given particularly having reported in Texas how political the issue is here, like, you know, transit is for liberal socialists and highways are for free market capitalists. That's kind of the political dynamic today in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
That is absolutely recent. Like that is a recent invention of our political system. And for a long time, it just wasn't quite so political.
Yeah. Well, Clayton Knoll, we had him on the show a long time ago, had a book about, you know, how that kind of partisanship came about. And it's really interesting history if folks get a chance to either listen to the show or read the book. But he's a political science, and I think he's at UC Santa Barbara now. But it's really interesting to think about how kind of that politicization happened, which is, you know, expanded the highway system and then voters kind of separate out and have different feelings about what is a priority to them. And so I think at those times in the 80s and 70s and 60s, and the cities weren't really written yet to a certain extent. I mean, the Phoenixes and the Houstons of the world were only a certain size. And now it's a totally different ballgame as much as they've grown. So it's interesting to see that time and that history and how it played out.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a juxtaposition in the book. Community builders like Las Manitas folks and the Forest Theater folks building something, repairing things, bringing, you know, community together. And then you have TxDOT ripping up communities that had been ripped up before or refusing to see value in some sort of revitalization. Was that something you consciously wove into the book?
I mean, honestly, like not really.
That's fine. That's just something I picked up.
Yeah, I love that. It's really been fun hearing from readers who pick things up that I'm like, yeah, I love that you made that connection. I mean, it's like I really wanted to show the impacts of these highways, and they exist in so many different ways and impact people so differently. And to show the kind of juxtapose that with the power that TxDOT has. So I guess in some ways, yes, but maybe not so intentionally.
I guess I was just kind of dumbfounded by some of the lack of response from some of the TxDOT engineers and other folks who just like didn't see the value in what an alternative scenario could be. Like it was all about cars and moving vehicles and not humans. And I feel like that's something that we come across fairly often in cities around the country and talking about transportation projects, but it was just so vivid in your book.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I really don't want to make TxDOT the absolute villain. I really do think it's like the Transportation Commission directing TxDOT and the governor directing the Transportation Commission. But at the root of all of this, I think, is this belief that like cars are freedom, cars give us independence. And that's kind of sort of uniquely American. And the inability to see beyond that, to consider that actually cars are not freedom for a lot of people. A lot of people can't drive, a lot of people cannot afford cars. I mean, it's just this kind of disregard for evidence, like decades of evidence showing that widening highways doesn't fix traffic. And there is this belief that actually more highways is going to bring economic prosperity to the state of Texas. And that is just the overarching narrative. And so it really becomes a political values conversation. It's really not a question of engineering or like, I think that a lot of TxDOT engineers understand it. You know, they see how those roadways are used. They see the basic geometry that Bragdon saw in 1960, which is like people take up far less space than cars do. But they answer to a larger political directive, which says, I mean, the Texas GOP party platform in 2022 says, like, we oppose any anti car measures. So it becomes not really
California
about,
style.
yeah, California style, exactly. And that, I mean, that to me was really revealing and instructive because at that point I had spent almost 2 years trying to answer the question, like, if widening highways doesn't fix traffic, why are we widening highways promising to fix traffic? And the answer is fundamentally a values one. A lot of people believe that cars create freedom and prosperity. And until we like really effectively counter that narrative, it will perpetuate.
It's interesting how that narrative drives the models too, right? Like the transportation models, because ultimately they're using these models and they're going through these black box simulations and they're telling you, well, this is what it's telling us. There's going to be, what was it, 18,000 hours of delay, and like trying to use these kind of really complicated numbers and things to scare people. But, you know, we've seen what happens in cities like San Francisco, Portland, et cetera, that tear down their highways and the dissipation of cars like a gas rather than liquid.
Yeah, my favorite example of that is in the I-35 environmental impact statement where, so I-35 cuts through Austin. The central segment is an 8-mile stretch of highway from South Austin to North Austin. And in the environmental impact statement, TxDOT has this little chart that says if we don't expand this highway by 2045, this 8-mile trip is going to take 223 minutes. Which is 3.5 hours. That's more than 3.5 hours. No one is going to take that trip. It is absolutely an absurd premise to project into the future that all of us commuters in Austin are going to be stuck in gridlock for 3.5 hours to travel 8 miles across the city. Like people simply won't take that trip. They will get there by a different mode. It just is an absurd premise, and yet it's presented as scientific fact.
There's a Doctor Who episode. I don't know if you're familiar with Doctor Who, but there's a Doctor Who episode in the reboot where basically this whole group of people is just stuck in a traffic jam for thousands of years, hundreds of years. And so they've had kids, they've done this thing, and they've been in the same spot. Their cars are in the same spot. I guess it's completely renewable or whatever, but they've just been stuck in this place. And it reminds me of that every time. It's like, there's something out there that's keeping you in here and you're stuck here, but you're just kind of living your lives and doing your things. And it's really interesting to see that kind of played out on a science fiction show, but then also discussed, you know, in EIRES in real life. Basically, that's what they're expecting is people are just going to sit in traffic for their whole lives for 3.5 hours.
Yeah, that we are just like somehow mindless robots that are going to take the same routes we've always taken. Like people are rational consumers of goods. That's like basic free market capitalism. Like as a good becomes harder or more difficult to access, like fewer people will access it. Like that's just basic supply and demand. And somehow TxDOT doesn't understand that.
Last time you were on the show, we talked about this story as a land use story. How is highway expansion specifically in the Texas context related to the housing policies that are happening in Houston and Austin and Dallas?
Yeah, we might have talked about this last time, but I got into this because I was covering housing at the Texas Observer, where I used to work. And I wrote this long story about Austin's effort to update its zoning code, which hasn't been done since 1984. And so as a result, like you can't build anything more dense than a single family home or a single family home with an ADU in most of Austin. So as Austin has boomed, all of that growth has happened in the suburbs. So like Round Rock and Pflugerville and to the south, Kyle and San Marcos. And like people who may want to live in Austin, people who are not necessarily choosing the suburban way of life are forced on the highway to get to work or school or anywhere that they need to go. So when I wrote that story, I interviewed this woman who wanted to buy a home in Austin, but she was like displaced out to the suburbs and was stuck on the highway to get home and to get to work. And then a few months later, TxDOT comes along and allocates $4 billion to widen I-35. And I just was like, oh, those are the same story, right? That like people are forced out of the city to afford a home, to build generational wealth. Even though they may not choose to have to drive so far, they're forced onto the highway to get back to Austin. And so like the suburbs and highways are like mutually reinforcing. They emerged at the same time. Highways were initially justified as a way to get people home to the suburbs. The kind of federal housing policy that led people to move to the suburbs, the massive subsidy of mortgages out kind of far away from city centers led to the kind of justification of highways. So those two have always been mutually reinforcing. And I think it's like especially true in places like Austin that are in the midst of an affordability crisis where we can't build anything more dense and a lot of land in Austin. And so people who might want to live and walk and bike to where they're going are driving. And like, it's just like until we fix housing policy, like, in some way, TxDOT's response is understandable. People are moving all along I-35. A lot of people rely on that highway. Let's widen it. Like they are, like TxDOT is sort of responding to demand. And so part of this is like the city of Austin needs to lessen that demand. They need to let more people live closer to where they're going.
It's an expensive elevator.
Yeah.
You got a lot of press and are chatting with folks about the book. Is there a question or a topic that you wish was talked about more?
I mean, I have talked a fair amount about it, but like climate change really motivates this book. Transportation is the leading contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in the US. On-road emissions in Texas alone account for 0.5% of global worldwide emissions. And that stat absolutely stunned me when I learned it. Again, it's like buried deep in a TxDOT technical document. But like, I can kind of talk endlessly about how terrified I feel about climate change and how the prospect of these highway expansions is like only going to make it worse. So like I mentioned at the top of the show, last summer was like one of the hottest on record in Austin. I think there was a string of like 45 straight days over triple digits in Austin. And at the last day of that stretch of triple digit days, TxDOT formally approved the I-35 expansion. And that combination felt so dire to me. Like I have been reporting on this stuff for 4 years. And so I sometimes it's like become intellectualized to me. I'm like a little bit desensitized to some of the outrage around that people experience and that like is justifiable for, homeowners, those in the footprint. But that really hit me. I really felt that on an emotional level of like, Austin is my home. I would like to continue living here for a very long time. And like, we are actively making it worse and harder to live here. So there's all this conversation around like tech parks and like, how do you make the highway better and more integrated into the city? How do you restitch communities? Biden is talking about that. And it's just like, really, I'm like, we're fundamentally making the problem worse by making this highway so much wider and incentivizing so much more car travel and therefore emissions. I understand that it's obviously a political statement because climate change has become politicized, but like I want people to see driving and highways as fossil fuel infrastructure. And like that absolutely motivated a lot of my reporting.
I think the most disappointed I was in reading the book, and not because of you, the writing was good, and so it made me disappointed, was the reaction of the feds to the I-45 stoppage and what happened afterwards. And, we have no control. The secretary was like, well, no, this is the process. NEPA is the way it is. And it felt so disheartening to feel like powerless, and that people that had power felt like they didn't have power, right? Like this cycle was just going to repeat itself because nobody was changing the structure underneath. They were just saying, well, this is how it is, and that's the way it is, so we're just going to let it go. For me, that was a part where I just was oh, my shoulders, I could feel my shoulders like slump. I was just like, what's the point, And I'm going to keep doing this. I'm going to keep doing the podcast. We're going to keep talking about this stuff, and it's important, but it just feels sometimes futile.
Well, that's what I mean. Like the oscillation between hope and despair
feels
pretty constant. I will say in response to that, something I learned that I didn't know, because I too, when FHWA paused this expansion in Houston, I was like, whoa, this is so significant. Like Biden and Buttigieg have come in with this like commitment to racial justice. Like they are going to do something different. But what I learned is they actually don't have the power to do something different because of how the surface transportation program is set up. And I learned most of this from Beth Osborne at Transportation for America. So like shout out to Beth for teaching me most of what I know about federal transportation policy, but she worked at DOT. And what I learned is like from her is that states like TxDOT get their money through formula funding. So FHWA like doesn't have that much power over how TxDOT spends its money. TxDOT cannot violate the law. That's essentially the only authority the federal government has, is to come in and say whether or not they violated the law. And so I think it is like a little dangerous when Biden and Buttigieg are out there making commitments to sustainability and racial equity when they actually do not have the power to follow through on those commitments. And so we are left with states. It absolutely causes me despair as well. But like what I learned is like the place to make change is at states. So like state legislatures and governors have a lot of power. And so Congress should write a better surface transportation reauthorization that gives Congress more power to oversee the transportation program. But like in the meantime, states, which are much more accessible to voters, like state legislatures and governors, can do so much to change how money is spent. And like I just went to Colorado, I reported on the Colorado Department of Transportation, which is doing really incredible things in response to a state mandate. So like it is absolutely a fight that needs to happen at the state level.
Yeah. And Bruce Bugg, I mean, what a supervillain, right? I have this question. What do you like more, ice cream or cake?
I get that reference. I get it. I don't want either.
It's a reference to in the book. Basically, he says for I-45, we're going to have our ice cream and our cake by, delaying the allocation of funding for the project and building some other highways and then building I-45 later. And neither of them seem like treats to me, but that's maybe just me and you. I don't know. Also, one of the things that struck me too is, and it being, in Austin at the time too, is why does Las Manitas keep getting screwed and the people that are people that are involved with them, because they're such an institution and yet they keep getting pushed around. And obviously the Las Manitas, the restaurant, got pushed out by a developer, and then the school that was formed from Las Manitas is now under threat of being moved by TxDOT because of the I-35 expansion.
Yeah, I don't know exactly why that school has had such a hard go of it. I mean, I think it just speaks to the fact that it's really expensive to live and do business in Austin. And, it's not unique to Austin that like childcare centers are having a really hard time. Like a lot of childcare centers closed during the pandemic. But it's just like, yeah, it encapsulates the heart of Austin, right? It's this like Spanish immersion preschool. The origin story is so distinctly Austin that it emerged out of this Mexican restaurant. And right there, like, I mean, for a lot of the time that I was reporting the book, they're like facing this existential threat of their continued existence. And that story was like one of the most moving to me, because like a homeowner losing their home is absolutely devastating. But this represents 200 families' lives. Like it's like the anchor for their lives. Like childcare is every day, twice a day, you are there dropping your kid off, picking your kid up. It's like where we are caretaking our young people. And like, it's not just like that they are going to get displaced by this highway. It's like, what kind of future are we leaving for these young Austinites? Like, what kind of city are they going to grow up in?
Yeah, it's frustrating. And I feel like, again, it goes kind of back to where I feel like transportation policy just doesn't take people into account, only cars or money, even for that matter. I mean, I feel like Michael Morris and some of the hostage taking
Yeah.
feels just like a quid pro quo type of situation where it's not necessarily about building a highway that might help people get to where they want to go, but it's like, oh, well, we have $9 billion from the feds. We got to use it now or else it's gone, or we'll take it away, And so it's not like those things can't get reallocated. I mean, yesterday I wrote in my newsletter about the 710 highway, taking all their money, almost $800 million, and reapportioning it in. And obviously Dallas, with Patrick Kennedy, who's featured in your book, the DART has actually reallocated some money for the subway and thinking about transit a little bit differently. So it's not just like a roads problem, but it's just like we can reallocate money if we want to, but we just decide not to. And so, those threats are looming and frustrating as well.
And they're not new. That is what I found looking through newspaper archives. I found DeWitt Greer was the Austin district engineer in the 1950s. I found a newspaper article where he comes to Austin City Council in like 1940 or something and says, well, if you don't want this East Avenue highway, like say so, and we'll take our money elsewhere. And that is exactly what Bruce Bugg told Houston in 2022. Like, hey, if you don't want this highway expansion, like we're going to take our $9 billion elsewhere and do something else with it. So it is absolutely a threat. And city leaders, I think, kind of understandably don't want to lose an investment in their region. Like that highway expansion is an expansion, but it also builds more modern flood infrastructure. It has safety improvements. So there are lots of like important things that money comes with. But what some leaders like Bugg and Morris are saying is like, well, if you want those things, if you want the good things like flood control and a safer highway, you have to accept an expansion.
Yeah. And jobs too, right? I mean, the spending of that much money, I mean, obviously that creates an economic development incentive that's unmatched. I mean, $8 billion, $10 billion, $15 billion, that's a lot of money. And so, some of that money gets into the pockets of workers and people and gets redistributed, but it's hard to fight back against that much capital.
Totally.
Houston recently passed a ballot measure asking for fair representation on the MPO board. And I feel like this gets to the discussion we were having a little bit earlier about impact and who has impact and who can make decisions and whether or not the president and the secretary of transportation actually have power. And so instead of going at the highway itself, the activists end up going at the decision-making apparatus, which is, I think, very innovative, but also interesting as well.
Yeah, and that story gives me a lot of hope. This is this grassroots group of just like normal people who have other jobs who formed to oppose the highway expansion. And they saw kind of, why do these highway expansions keep getting proposed? Like, what is the kind of engine behind this? And they saw that a lot of that power lies with their metropolitan planning organization, which is called the Houston Galveston Area Council. And every city has one. They're basically like regional planning bodies, and they help allocate federal transportation money. But in most cities, those metropolitan planning organizations, the composition skews to suburban members. So there are more suburban members, or suburban members have much higher voting power compared to their population. So the city of Houston has it was like the core population in the Houston Galveston area region, and yet they have like 2 or 3 votes, even though that's where most people live and also where most people of color live. And so this group, to Stop Text I-45, some of these volunteers were like, hey, could we change that? Could we force the Houston Galveston Area Council's Metropolitan Planning Organization to have proportional voting, proportional to population? And I think that's important because all along during this I-45 fight, local leaders opposed it. The mayor opposed it. The Harris County judge opposed it. Harris County sued TxDOT to try to stop it, and yet they really had no say. And so the whole point of this ballot measure was to say, hey, our elected representatives in the city of Houston should have more power to decide what happens in Houston. And so they went door to door. It was Prop B, Prepare for Houston, and they knocked on I think more than 100,000 doors across the city. I wrote a story about it for City Lab, and so I went out and canvassed with them. And it was this really remarkable effort. It's so wonky. It's like, even explaining to you, you know what I'm talking about, and it's so wonky. And it was so amazing to see volunteers just knock on normal people's doors and explain this kind of obscure governmental body that most people had not heard of, explain how it was not serving them, not representing them, and saying, hey, do you want it to represent you? Do you want it to be different? And so it was on the ballot in November, and it passed with a wide margin. And now there's this fight in Houston of making that body more proportional to population. And ideally in the future, that means that they will not approve a massive highway expansion when it comes through and negatively impacts a lot of Houstonians.
I asked Beth about this, actually, Beth Osborne about this, and there's a sentence in the Infrastructure Act about MPOs and rethinking them. And I think it was mostly for new MPOs. And she told me that I was reading into it maybe too much, but I think that that's kind of something that should be used by more people to try to grab back representation for their cities, which make up these large proportions of populations, but they're underrepresented because of the suburban allocation of seats on them. And, something like this happened in San Diego actually recently, where Jerry Brown actually said, we need to reapportion how the MPO represents the region because it's not really fair right now. And they ended up getting very close to doing road pricing because of that. So it's interesting to see what can actually happen if you actually get the representation to work out in the favor of the larger population, which is, San Diego or Houston or whatever the main city is in any of these metropolitan planning organizations, which are set up by the feds to dole out transportation money.
Yeah, and also getting people to understand what they are. I mean, even when I started reporting on this, my eyes would just glaze over. I'm like, I don't know if I can cover this. It's so boring. It's so wonky. But they are hugely important for not just how transportation funding gets spent, but in Houston, it's flood mitigation money. So a lot of what galvanized people in Houston is that the city of Houston suffered most of the damage from Hurricane Harvey, but got an absolute fraction of percentage of the federal recovery money. And that was because of actions the MPO took. So that's is a real impact on people's lives. And I think making, again, these very wonky bureaucratic governmental bodies real, their actions have consequences on real people. And I think the grassroots group there did a really effective job of communicating that.
Well, I think one of the lessons that I take from the book is that people want something different. I think there are many people who are just living off inertia, many people at TxDOT, for example. But at some point, politicians and the folks that create this can't have their proudest moment be a 22-lane freeway, right? And still win elections. And so I feel like there's a small amount of movement, but it's positive movement. And there were many times where the book made me sad. I actually, when they were talking about the littles, I was a little bit teary-eyed because I have a little as well, and I just care about this stuff a lot. And so I think that that's kind of something to take away, is that there's hope on the horizon, and if we just keep pushing, we might actually get there.
I think so. I mean, you mentioned at the top of this Connor Doherty's book about the housing movement, and I really see the anti-freeway movement maybe where the YIMBY movement was a decade ago. It's still very new. A lot of this, this group, Stop Text I-45, has been around for 5 years. What could they accomplish in 10? What could groups in other cities across the country, there are freeway fighters in almost every city in the country, and they are beginning to talk to each other. I went to Cincinnati this fall for the first annual gathering of the Freeway Fighters Network. So I talked to, there were 25 groups from 17 states, and they're talking to each other. They're strategizing. They're trying to create a larger national movement out of what were sort of disparate, kind of isolated campaign. And so I think indeed people want something else. More and more people are negatively impacted by car dependency. It is increasingly becoming a climate fight as young people see these highways and the emissions that they create, emissions our cars create, and say no, we don't want any more of this. Climate leaders don't want freeways. And so that really heartens me, that kind of overlap of climate activists with freeway fighters.
Yeah. And thanks, Kirk Watson.
Yeah, our climate mayor is going to wind
Climate mayor who put in the money initially to do it.
Yeah.
Megan, the book is City Limits, Infrastructure, Inequality, and the Future of America's Highways. Where can folks pick it up? Because I think everybody should have a copy.
Thank you. You can buy it anywhere you buy books. Local bookstores are great. I also will give a plug to the audiobook, which I narrated, so people can listen to it on their commute or walking around their city or on their bus or train ride.
Oh, awesome. Thanks, Megan, for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire, published first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this week's show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Find us at patreon.com/theoverheadwire. You can sign up for our 20-year-old newsletter as well and find everything else, including multiple ways to support the show, at theoverheadwire.com. You can also listen to our show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.